Welcome to this video tutorial. In this video, I will talk about 3D character tools in Unity. I will specifically talk about rigging, animating, and controlling your characters through inverse kinematics. All those scenarios, there's tools available in Unity that solve problems that you would otherwise have to use external tools for example Maya, Blender, and Modo. I have some sample characters here, and I will talk about a couple of use cases, and I will more broadly speak about how to use these tools or what kind of things you can achieve with them, instead of going into more detailed tutorials about how you actually would go about step by step doing that. The tools I will briefly mention are Puppet 3D, Scale, UMotion, Simple Bones Animation, Final IK, PuppetMaster, Bone Controller, and third-person motion controller. Let's just jump right in with Puppet 3D. So Puppet 3D is the tool in Unity to add a rig to a character, so to rig and create bones for a character. This character here is from Adobe Fuse, and I specifically exported it without a rig, so it doesn't have any bones applied. And instead, I created a rig with Puppet 3D. You can see here we have bones that I just in a matter of minutes applied to the mesh, and then we have these cubes here, or those boxes. Those are controls for the spine, for the head, and then inverse kinematics for the hands and the feet. Let's get rid of our bones, and then you can see I can simply select the inverse kinematics here, the control for the hand, and I can move the arm around. You can already see there's some issues here with the shirt, and also because there's no vertices under the shoulder here, under the shirt. You can already see the mesh breaking here, but those are issues that are really on a case-by-case basis, depending on the kind of model that you use, where you really have to dig into the details of the tool and then see how well it works and what kind of approach to take. And so far, I've only used Puppet 3D for a couple of days, and I'm already really happy about it, and I can see a lot of different cases where I can use it in my workflow. And once you rig the character, you can then also animate the character using your normal animation tools in Unity, so it can simply keyframe, for example, the movements created by this inverse kinematics tool here. Now, this is, of course, really useful if you have a character that is on, let's say, one of the marketplaces like TurboSquid or CG Trader, and it doesn't have a rig applied, but you really like it and you want to use it. And instead of having to use like Maya or some of the other external tools, you simply import it into Unity and you apply a rig there and work with your model. And I think that's a really, really useful case where otherwise you might not be able to use the model at all, or you would need somebody to rig it in an external tool if you don't have the skills. Now there's also another use case, and that is if you have an existing character that has a rig applied, but you're not quite happy with the rig. Let's move over here to Izzy. Izzy is the standard free character from iClone, and it's available on the asset store. Izzy already has a rig applied. We can simply have a look at her rig. Now those green buttons here are a different tool, that is Scale, and I will talk about that in a minute. But let's have a look here. We can move around the different limbs, but you can already see just using forward kinematics, so just moving the bones directly is not going to work. Instead, we would have to use inverse kinematics. But a bigger problem that we have with this rig also is that if we actually move her head around, you can see that the hair is going to poke through the mesh. And that is a fairly common problem that I see with a lot of characters with long hair. And the way you would solve this usually is you also have to animate the hair so that it moves along. Now, there's different ways to do this. You could either use vertex animations, or very commonly, you could also just have a rig applied to the hair and then animate the hair as well, so that it just won't poke through. Now, let's have a look at the rig that comes with Izzy. Now you can already see that there's only one joint up here, and it's not really related to the hair at all. So basically, at this point, Izzy's hair is fairly useless unless we do something about it. What we can then do is use Puppet 3D, and we select the hair and go through a number of steps to actually apply a rig to the hair manually. Now, obviously, the hair is not a standard character, so that auto rigging won't work. We would have to manually do that. I apply the rig through Puppet 3D. And it doesn't matter how many bones you use, whether you want to have control over the tips separately. I could create 10 bones here, or just 2 or 3. But it was a really painless process, and I'm quite happy about having the ability to customize an existing mesh, an existing rig, to the point where I can then use it much more appropriately in my applications. And that is basically the second big use case for Puppet 3D, to use it on existing rigs where you might have to modify certain things. You can also just create a mod rig, which basically provides additional control on top of existing animations, where you can then blend between animations and inverse kinematics. But that is just something that is then also detailed in the documentation of Puppet 3D. So have a look around there and see whether this might be one of the tools that is really helpful for you. I really find it helpful for myself, and I've used it just for a couple days. All right, next on the list. The next set of tools we are looking at are animation tools. So let's have a look at Scale first. Scale has been around for a number of years, and I've used Scale pretty much almost from the start when it was available, because back then it was the only animation tool, or pretty much the one animation tool you would use if you were to animate within Unity. Now, Scale, you've already seen the controls here, is when I click any of the skin mesh renderers in my scene here, any mesh that has a rig applied and that I can animate, you see these 2 green buttons here. And you can click Start, Edit, and you already see the rig of that character visualized. And you have these the small controls here, and you can then basically just either start rotating those bones directly, or you can switch to inverse kinematics mode, select a joint that you want to use, and then start moving the character around. You can pin and really set a lot of different keys, so it really works well with the existing animation tools. I would just go in the animation pane, create an animation, and then keyframe all of the different things I need to move around. And this is basically the way I animated for the last couple of years. I have to say, over time it was a bit of a struggle, because the tool evolved alongside Mechanim, as Mechanim was first introduced, and there were a lot of bugs. But I have to say, the developers stuck around and really did a good job at addressing all those different issues. Now, let's have a look back here. Scale over time also added a lot of smaller other tools that, first of all, I'm not really using too much, but that maybe some people might find useful. One of the bigger features that was added over time was an integrated timeline editor. Now, this would be absolutely fantastic if the integrated, the actual Unity timeline editor wouldn't exist. So these are basically now, this is, I would almost say, redundant. I'm not really sure whether it sets itself apart through something that's not available in Unity, but at this point, I'm just using Timeline and Cinemachine in Unity instead of going with this integrated timeline editor. There's other tools like a mesh morpher, which is really interesting, because then you can simply change the vertices of a mesh and animate those basically as to create kind of blend shapes. However, I have to say, with some of those smaller tools, you are really just fighting the interface. It's not very intuitive, and I think the biggest problem with Scale is its interface, that there's just other alternatives out there that just feel much more intuitive and are much easier to use. Nothing about the functionality. I really like Scale. I've used it for years, and it saved me probably hundreds, if not thousands of hours, and saved whole projects just because I was easily able to animate my characters. But the interface is just something that could always be improved, and especially with some of those smaller tools like the mesh morpher. That is Scale in a nutshell. Again, I can really recommend it, especially for just animating, plain up, straight up animating. But then there's other alternatives out there, for example, UMotion. Now, again, I've also not used UMotion for a long time yet. I've only started using it just a short while ago. But already, I absolutely love it for just its animation capabilities. Let's have a look at UMotion. So first of all, you need 2 different windows. The first one is a clip editor. The second one is a pose editor. And we simply drag Izzy up here in the pose editor. And now we have control over all sorts of things. We can make visible all the different bones. And then we also have control over some of those muscle groups. So for example, we can choose, for example, hands, and have a lot of control over different movements. Now, UMotion comes with its own animation window, so it's in this case separate from the animation window itself. However, you can sync with Unity's animation and timeline editor window in order to sort of animate while other things are going on at the same time. So you can even animate and create work with UMotion while the game is playing, and while you have, for example, your timeline running, or you want to scrub your timeline and really see how your animation integrates. And I think this is like really, really powerful. There's a number of really sort of like detailed things that I think are really neat about UMotion, but I think at the base, it is just a really solid animation tool that I feel like is unsurpassed in terms of its interface and in terms of the functionality it provides. It's really clean, it's got good documentation, and I really like it for that. Now, it doesn't have some of the other extra tools that Skilly comes with, but then again, some of those tools, I'm not 100% sure how they fit into the overall package of Skilly. So here, with UMotion, you really just get straight up animations that really integrate well with overall Unity. Some people might think one of the downsides is that it doesn't natively use Unity's animation window, so the animation timeline. Instead, it has its own clip editor. But I feel that, can be an advantage and a disadvantage. Again, you can sync it with the animation window, and then in the end, you would simply just export your animation to a clip that's usable in Unity. The other advantage is that UMotion also comes with a free version. So there's UMotion Community, which you can download for free and really see whether you like the interface and whether it's a tool that you can make yourself familiar with. Whereas with Skilly, there's simply Skilly, and it's an upfront investment of, at the moment, $50 when it's not on sale. Lastly, I want to mention Simple Bones animation, simply because I thought that for some people this might already be sufficient. It's an animation tool that simply visualizes your bones in a character's rig, and it does not provide any inverse kinematics functionality. So if somebody wants to animate through inverse kinematics, which I guess is fairly common, then Simple Bones animation will not work for you. It is simply showing you all the bones and joints, and you can then start rotating those for your animations and just keyframing them. So it's a very limited just use case, but I feel like for somebody who just wants to animate using the bones through bone rotations, so if you're not working with a lot of walk cycles and things like that, then this might already be enough. I just wanted to mention that. Now, I've already talked about inverse kinematics a few times when animating, but there's a lot of other things you can also do with inverse kinematics that just go beyond just an animation that is keyframed. Instead, there is more dynamic interactions that your characters are capable of. And for that, there is a number of tools that can be useful for this. The first one is Final IK. And Final IK I've also used for several years alongside with Skilly, and I have to say I'm really happy with the application. And it solves a lot of problems that people might have when using characters in their games or applications. And those include a look at behavior that's very realistic, reaching for objects that are dynamic, or enhancing existing animations with sort of targeting them towards a more dynamic environment, and also enhancing walk animations so that the feet are actually grounded in uneven terrain. Those are some of the features that might be useful on top of just having a traditional animation pipeline and just animating your character. Now, I'm only going to show you one feature here as an example, and that is the look at behavior. So if I just play my game, then you can see that if I move this camera around, the characters will keep looking at the camera. Only those three Izzies here. Now, the right one is a bit messed up with her hair, so let's ignore her for a moment. You can see that the characters can be quite flexible. They're not animated right now, but even if they were in an idle animation, they would still be able to dynamically follow the camera and look at it regardless of where you are. Now, this is a behavior that can be achieved by pretty much all of the IK inverse kinematic systems that I'm going to talk about. And it's a pretty standard feature. And it is something that's very neat and can add a lot of interactivity to your game. So here with this Izzy, we have a look at IK script through Final IK. Now it's pretty simple to set up. You simply add the script, and then you manually add as many bones of your spine. So basically anywhere from sort of the just above the hip to the neck as you want. So I think this is like at least 2 to 3 bones. The more bones you have there, the more detail and the more sort of dynamic, the more fluid your twisting of the upper body will be. And then you add the eyes if you have separate eyes. Now in this case, actually, Izzy only has one object for both eyes, which makes it a bit hard. It's not going to work well in terms of rotating, so I think this will just be ignored. But if you have a left and right eye separately, then actually the character can also look at the target through the corners of her eyes. And then you have here these controls of the weight of how much you want, for example, Izzy to turn her upper body or only look with her head, so only turn her head towards the target. And there's a lot of like controls of what the target is, and that really is a fairly straightforward way to just achieve some look at behavior that's dynamic. So this really is on top of an animation. You could just have all sorts of animations. Izzy could be running, but then she sees something, and you can then blend in this overall weight of the look at IK, where she starts looking at an object, and you could simply tween this with one of the tween applications in the Unity asset store to kind of change this value from 0 to 1, over time, over a second or two. And that is Final IK. Over here, we have a character that uses Bone Controller, and I feel like Final IK and Bone Controller are trying to achieve a lot of similar things. So Bone Controller here, you can already see visualizes the bones. So if you use Bone Controller and you put in the root transform, in this case I have to use the absolute parent of the character, not the body, and it will automatically then recognize all the different bones that are within the body. And you can set all kinds of constraints for those bones and manually do a lot of things, but it will already like do a pretty good job out of the box just recognizing everything. And then Bone Controller has this neat feature of, like, it calls it motors, where you can add different motors to a character to achieve certain functionality. It's almost sort of like a modular approach where if you need to look at behavior, again, like adding the look at behavior of Final IK to the character, here I simply add different motors, and then I can enable and disable them separately. It will basically do the same thing as Final IK, and it will just auto-generate here sort of what it recognizes to be the head, the neck, and the spine. And then, as you saw before, if we play this again, it will also twist and turn to stay on the target of the camera. Now, same behavior can be achieved, for example, for picking up items or swinging at a target, aiming at a target. All of these things can be very dynamic, and you can really constrain sort of the body or make it react to its environment much better. There's a number of things, or actually there's just one feature each for the two systems where I think they are slightly different. And that is for Final IK, you have a pretty good aim IK, where they really customized one of their systems towards holding a gun and pointing at targets and really like smoothly transitioning between all like different states. One of the other things is their so-called interaction system, and I think the interaction system really is kind of unique because they already sort of pre-implemented things like pushing a button, opening a door, and really sort of also shaping or controlling the hand for those movements and really blending in and out of opening a door, for example, or picking up an item. And I think those things are really great. And I've used those in my projects also extensively. For example, reaching for a pencil case of a student who's sitting there or raising their hand and so on. So there's a lot of different actions that you can actually dynamically use where you're not really sure where the target is going to be in your environment, but you just know you need to be able to reach for that. Now, the other unique thing that I think is really cool for Bone Controller is its ability to have the impact motor. And there really we're looking at creating colliders along your bones, so that you just, instead of having one big capsule, you really have a good collision detection system for your body, and then really interact with sort of impact on the character. I think that is a really neat thing. Now, something similar can be achieved with a tool that's also made by the Final IK author, and that is called PuppetMaster. And I really just want to briefly mention PuppetMaster, just because it fits really well with Final IK. So with PuppetMaster, you can basically apply ragdoll physics, so that if there's, your character is colliding with something, it basically, the ragdoll physics takes over, the character falls down, and then you can sort of blend in between sort of physics taking over or your animations taking over, or Final IK taking over. And I think that's really neat. For example, being hit by a bullet, or being hit by a baseball bat and the character just falls over. That's pretty neat. Now, on the other hand, Bone Controller also has several different assets on the asset store by the same author. Bone Controller seems to be working really well with third-person motion controller. There's also another first-person camera controller. I think both of those really integrate well, or make a lot of sense to using with Bone Controller, where you have control over, in this case here, third-person motion controller, about the different animations, blending between the different animations, having a lot of control over how your character jumps and transitions from one animation to another, to have full control over how you want to walk, how you want to jump, and so on. And I feel that's a really neat thing to use in conjunction with Bone Controller. So there, I feel if you choose one over the other, either Final IK or Bone Controller, it makes sense to also just go with the same author, because those assets have been built with the same mindset, and probably also make it much easier in terms of the code of integrating both of them in your project. So I have to say I'm quite happy both with Final IK and Bone Controller. I don't have a lot of experience with PuppetMaster and third-person motion controller, but Final IK and Bone Controller both are really high-quality assets. I've used them both. I've definitely used Final IK much more than Bone Controller, but I feel both have excellent documentation. I have to say Bone Controller's documentation and video tutorials really stand out. So the author did a really good job with that, and I can only recommend both of them absolutely. And I think that concludes this video tutorial. I really just wanted to give you a brief overview of what you can do with your characters, whether that's rigging your character, animating your character, or being able to enhance the interactions with the character through inverse kinematics by reaching for targets, or aiming at certain things, looking at items, or making sure that, for example, your walk animation really collides with the ground well, and the feet of your character are not just floating or intersecting with the floor. I think those are really neat things that will massively enhance the realism and sort of the quality of a game or of an application. And I feel like those are almost must-haves if you're serious about building applications. I can go into more detail with any of these tools, and just let me know in the comments below, and I can create follow-up tutorials about any of the specific tools or some of the use cases. Just let me know. And thanks for watching. See you next time.